Hello, I'm Bianca.
I'm Paloma.
And I'm Tom.
And you are listening to The Climate Press. A podcast where we aim to bring together climate science with public understanding and action.
Today on the show, we're joined by Dr. Kat Scott, the University Academic Fellow in Biosphere Climate Interactions with the Institute for Climate and Atmospheric Science at the University of Leeds. She is also director of the Leeds Ecosystem, Atmospheric and Forest Centre. Her research is currently looking at how trees and forests affect the climate and air quality. Welcome to the show, Kat.
Hello. Great to be here.
On previous episodes, we've been talking about sustainability, climate change and adaptation. And today we would like to talk to you, Kat, about the most obvious and natural solution to climate change, trees. So what's the role of trees on climate? How do they work?
So the reason that we think trees, the reason that they do play an important role in the climate system is that as trees are growing, and in fact any plants with leaves, they're taking carbon dioxide in during the process of photosynthesis. And they're sort of doing that constantly. For trees that lose their leaves in the winter, they'll be doing it in the summer when they've got their leaves. And it means that they're constantly taking this carbon dioxide into their leaves. And the reason that's important is that they then turn it into a more longer-lived form of carbon, and then they use it to basically help themselves to grow. So they actually use it to build their trunks and their branches. So when you see a tree, you plant it, and then over time it'll grow larger and larger and larger. And so we can actually see that process of the carbon basically accumulating on the tree. So when we think about an old, mature tree with a really wide trunk, it is storing hundreds of kilograms, possibly tons of carbon in its trunk and in its branches and in its roots as well. That's something that we don't always think about because we can't see the roots of trees, but they are storing quite a lot of carbon below the ground as well. So the reason that we think that they can help us with climate change is that their forests still at the moment cover about a third of the Earth's land surface. So even though we think of forests as being under threat, and they are in lots of parts of the world, we still have huge areas of the planet that are covered by forests, and it's really important that we maintain those because they're storing large quantities of carbon, but they're also helping to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere all the time. So one of the things that we think has contributed to climate change is the fact that we've lost forests around the world. So during the process of deforestation, trees might be cut down, and that does two things. So once they get cut down, it prevents them from continuing to grow and from removing more carbon during their lifetime. But also, they're often cut down and then burned, and that means that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere. So it's kind of undoing all of the hard work that the trees have done during their lifetime. So we know that the trees are doing this job of removing the carbon from the air, but trees in different places around the world will have a slightly different impact on the climate. So it really depends on how a couple of different effects that they have add together. So one thing that we know is that trees that are in countries at really high northern latitudes, so the north of Russia, Canada, Scandinavia, they tend to be very dark coloured, the leaves, or the needles that tends to be on those trees. And they also are in a part of the world that will be covered by snow for several months of the year. And that really stark contrast in the colour actually has an important effect on the climate, because if the trees weren't there and the land was covered in snow, that snow would be really bright and reflective. So as the sun's energy falls on that land, it would be reflected away, and that has a cooling effect. So if those trees are there and they have a dark colour, they're actually absorbing more of the sun's energy and preventing that reflection of radiation. So when we're trying to work out the impact of, say, a forest in a particular location, it's a case of working out how much of some of these other effects the forests are having, and how all the different things compare to one another. So we think actually that for trees at very high northern latitudes, this effect on the reflectivity of the land is actually big enough to dominate over the amount of carbon that the trees are storing. And so they are having an overall warming effect on the climate.
And what about trees, for example, in the Amazon, where they have an additional effect on, they play a key role as a source of moisture, and they control the weather system. So what's the effect of deforestation in the Amazon in terms of local climate? Or
that's right. So trees in the Amazon and other tropical parts of the world have a kind of different balance of impacts. So they will, generally they are storing more carbon than the trees in the high northern latitudes. But they also, as you say,
Why is that like?
Just the kind of species, they tend to be larger. The species that are there accumulate more carbon. They're more dense, basically, in carbon. And so they don't quite have the same effect on the surface, on the reflectivity of the surface, as you get at high latitudes because of the lack of snow, but also because they are slightly lighter in colour in general. But as you mentioned, they have this important impact on the amount of moisture that's in the atmosphere. So some colleagues of ours from the School of Earth and Environment did look at that a few years ago and looked at how much rain fell in different parts of the Amazon. And they worked out that actually the amount of rain that you saw depended on how much forest a particular parcel of air had kind of gone over before the rainfall occurred. So the more forest the air passed over, the more moisture it accumulated, and then the more rain it was able to deliver to another part of the forest. So we think that this impact on the moisture cycle is really important. But it's also important from a kind of climate and energy perspective, because this the transfer of water from the surface into the air is a strong cooling mechanism locally. So that means that the forests there are cooling down the local climate.
cool. I love that answer.
Same. Yeah. And also how you're touching on like different species having different effects in different places. Like not all trees are doing the same thing. So you've talked a bit about trees and their relationship to the climate. I'm wondering if we could talk about specifically trees and air quality and how this kind of relationship works. Again, with the uptake of carbon emissions, a lot of times in city planning, trees are discussed as one solution. So can you tell us a bit maybe about your project of living labs for air quality in Leeds?
So we recently, in the last couple of years, we actually had 2 different living lab projects. So one of them was looking at all of the trees on the university campus, and another one was looking at the air quality. And so I'll come back to the details of those, but at the moment we're sort of thinking about how we can try and link the two projects together. So what we did with the tree project was to look at all of the trees that we've got on the university campus, to count them, to work out where they are, to identify which species they are, and then with a team of very enthusiastic volunteers, we set about measuring all of the trees, taking basically the most important measurements are things like how wide the trunk is, how tall the tree is, but also how big the kind of canopy of the tree and its leaves are. So we would measure how wide the crown of the tree was, because that's really important.
How do you measure that?
So it's not very high tech. It involves standing under the tree with a tape measure and 2 people, one standing on each side of the canopy of the tree, and just measuring literally how wide it is.
Okay, cool.
So during that project, we discovered that there were over 1,400 trees on the university campus.
Really?
And there were more than 100 different species, which was really surprising because if you walk around, you don't necessarily. I think everyone would say we've got a nice
Green.
leafy campus, but it's not. You wouldn't think that there were more than 100 different kinds of tree species. So that was really interesting to find out. And a lot of that is down to the fact that people would bring interesting trees onto the campus and plant them when they'd been to visit another part of the world. So we've probably got a more diverse set of trees here than you would expect to find in other parts of the city.
Is there a benefit to diversity?
Well, that's a great question, because we think that in terms of trees that are best for the local wildlife, we think that having the native tree species is kind of best for the wildlife that we would expect to find here. One thing that's good about having more diversity in tree species is that it can make your trees as a whole more resilient, because if one particular species is vulnerable to a disease or a particular pest, then it's less of a problem for the tree canopy as a whole. So that's one reason why having a bit more diversity can be a good thing. So we measured all of the trees, and then we used some software called iTree that helps us to work out, for any given tree, how much carbon does it store, how much air pollution would we expect it to be removing from the atmosphere. So that's something that we think, so we still don't completely understand exactly how trees influence air quality in urban areas. It's really complicated. But we do think that the leaves of trees basically act as little surfaces for pollutants to deposit on. And so we think that trees with kind of big flat leaves will actually take in gases through the same holes that they have on their surface as they would take in carbon dioxide. And then trees like conifers, that have more needle-shaped leaves, they tend to have a kind of waxy coating on that we think enables particles that are in the air to stick to the needles. And so that can end up being, if the pollution sticks to the leaves and then it gets washed off, that can end up being a way that the pollution gets actually removed from the air. It's ending up in the water instead, so that's not necessarily a good thing. But what we found is that actually the bigger your tree, essentially the more leaves it's got, the more kind of volume your tree occupies, the more pollution it's going to be potentially taking up. So that was our project to look at the trees specifically. But at the same time, we did another project to look at the air quality on the university campus, because we realised that actually, although there's kind of increasing attention being paid to what the air quality is like in our cities, we actually don't really know that much about it, because there are a couple of measurement stations that feed their data directly into the government-run network of air quality sensors. And then the council has a few of its own measurement stations too, but in terms of the air quality on the university campus and how it actually changes depending on where you are, we didn't really have any data about that at all. So again, with a team of enthusiastic volunteers, we set about walking around the campus with portable air quality monitors, so that we could start to build up maps of how the air quality changed. And what we could see from that was a really strong difference in the level of pollution that people would be exposed to if they were walking down the main road outside the university, versus if they were even just slightly further away from the main road, walking behind some of the buildings. The air quality there was a lot better.
And is this like a visual map you literally had?
Yes, yes. So we've got these maps now. So if people are interested, you can look for Living Lab for Air Quality. If you just search for that on the internet, you should be able to find those maps.
We'll definitely put them on the website.
So you think that trees improve air quality in our cities, and how easy it is to communicate these to policymakers and make them act according to this great solution and cheap solution? Or how cheap it is, because maybe we think it's easy, but it's not that easy.
I think policymakers have a really difficult job, because they're trying to... So I suppose there's the people making the policies, and then there are people working in local authorities that are having to basically facilitate the development of their city in line with the policies that have been made. So I think that's where things become a bit difficult, because it's very difficult for them to justify doing something that doesn't generate economic revenue when the policies that are in place tend to prefer that kind of development. So it's a tricky area, and there's a lot of research going on now to try and look at, could we value development in a different way? So rather than just saying, is this thing going to bring us more revenue into the city, to think actually, well, it may not directly, but it may have a positive benefit on people's well-being.
Yeah.
But at the moment, those things, there's not really an official way to kind of take that into account. So it's sort of left to people's judgment. And so with trees, they fall into that category, really, that a lot of people like them and would prefer to have more trees. But until there are policies in place that actively prioritise tree planting, that becomes difficult. So Leeds City Council have actually just recently, in the last week, supported a policy basically to try to double the tree cover across the city in the next couple of decades. And so they're starting with the land that they basically manage, so all of the parks and the green spaces that they manage, but the ambition is to try and increase our canopy cover across the city so that it's double what it is now, which is a really ambitious target.
Okay.
And do you think policymakers in terms of Leeds or the UK are making the same effort to conserve or preserve the trees that we already have than planting new trees?
Yeah, I think there is a tension there, because sometimes if a tree is removed, there have been policies in place to say that it should then be replaced with 3 newly planted trees. And that's good, but it does give the impression that a mature tree can be replaced by 3 new saplings, which isn't necessarily the case in terms of the kind of benefits we've been talking about for carbon intake and also air quality. A big, large stature tree is doing many times more the work of 3 newly planted trees. So I think we do need to be a bit careful that we're not considering those 2 things to be equivalent. I think now, over the next couple of years, it's going to be interesting actually to see what happens, because there is a lot of attention now on planting new trees, and we do need to make sure that we don't forget about the trees that we've got and make sure that we look after them.
Yeah, because I think a lot of it comes down to what those like existing trees and forests and woodlands, like where they are as well, and like this kind of claim to land that's also coming in as a factor. So the other day I heard about they're planning to build a sustainable infrastructure, but right through the middle of old woodlands. So it's like constantly going to be this battle at odds. And again, hearing the fact that, okay, we can't just cut trees down and then replant new ones. Like, it's not the same thing. Like, so I think that is interesting you bring that up, because it is it's going to be a balance. Like,
it is, and some of those older woodlands they're basically irreplaceable because they have been there for such a long time that the kind of biodiversity, the ecosystem that's developed there, is not something you can just recreate by planting some new trees somewhere else. Exactly. It's just not going to happen. So, and again, how we weigh up those 2 things, when someone can demonstrate, I'm going to build this infrastructure and it's going to achieve X, Y, and Z.
yeah.
It's difficult for the woodland to kind of stand up to that kind of pressure.
Yeah, exactly. It's a tough balance for sure.
I wanted to ask you about which are the countries that are planting trees that grow relatively fast and they burn it quickly to produce paper, and do you think those countries are reducing those practices, or is becoming a more common technique? Because, well, I don't know if in Australia they have eucalyptus or stuff like that, but Spain is full of that and they burn everything.
So, yeah, it comes back to the fact that not all trees are doing the same thing, but also not all trees should be in all parts of the planet. And I think the problem arises when we try and grow these monocultures of non-native species simply to provide either the timber or paper products. and they are not naturally found in that part of the world, it doesn't have a good impact on the biodiversity, because they can be considered as an invasive species, and they are not necessarily providing the same benefits basically as they would if they were native to the area. One issue we're going to face in the future, though, is that as the climate changes, trees or species of tree that might have been able to live in certain parts of the world may no longer be able to, and we'll start to see that trees that would tend to live in a particular temperature band might end up kind of shifting a bit because it's now too hot for them to live where they lived before. And
whoa, that's interesting to think about, because they can't move obviously as easily as other species.
So a forest can gradually, you can imagine a forest picking up its roots and just hopping over the border to a slightly cooler climate. But the way that it would happen would be that they'll kind of shift gradually over time, like the lower edge of a forest won't be able to be there anymore, and they'll shift. But it does mean that we could see parts of the planet that we in our lifetimes are used to having a particular kind of forest that just not able to live there anymore. And then you have to think about all of the other species that are relying on those areas of forest to live. There's just a kind of cascade of effects that can result from that.
Wow. That kind of leads into this question, what we're talking about then, or what are some of the effects that we can expect to see as we lose our trees, and we continue to lose them through either the forest fires that are happening across Australia and the west coast of the United States, North America, deforestation. Also, you mentioned species and pests and invasive species that are attacking trees, and just general extinction of them. Like, what are some of the effects that we can expect to see?
I think one thing that it's important to think about is that we don't fully know exactly what will happen. If we lost a particular species of tree, or if we lost trees at a large scale in a particular area, we can run climate models to simulate what will happen, but we kind of haven't done these experiments for real, for good reason.
Yeah.
And so I think as much as we can look into it with models, we have to bear in mind that there are kind of interconnections between things that we probably haven't yet discovered.
Right.
So I think one of the issues I mentioned earlier with the Amazon rainforest putting so much moisture into the air, we think that there's probably a point at which the kind of detrimental impacts of rising temperatures and changes to rainfall patterns, in combination with land use change, would start to mean that the forest could kind of die back, because it's kind of suffering as a result of climate change. And we really don't have a good idea of exactly at what point those kinds of people call them tipping points, when something kind of dramatic could happen to a particular system.
I just got goosebumps.
Yeah. And I think that's terrifying, really, that we don't understand it well enough to be messing around with it so much. And I mean, you could argue, so we shouldn't rely on planting trees to kind of get us out of the problem, because we don't understand exactly what the impacts would be in every location. But I think we can be confident that putting the trees back where they were originally is probably not going to be a bad thing to do.
So that kind of brings us on to an important point. The Committee on Climate Change in the UK said that we need to be planting around 3 billion trees to combat the effects of climate change. And I've seen other numbers and figures, and depends, I guess, on what scale you're looking at. So can you talk a bit about that? Like, where does this number come from, and what does that really mean?
Yeah, so this was from a report that the Committee on Climate Change looked at how the UK could possibly get to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by the middle of the century. And so they looked at lots of different options in terms of reducing emissions from energy, different ways we would do transport, and they came up with some scenarios that could help us get as close as possible to having net zero emissions by 2050 from all of our actual kind of greenhouse gas emission sources. But they couldn't quite get to zero. And so what they said was that if we were to drastically increase the tree cover in the UK, then those trees could be accumulating enough carbon that they could help us to kind of close that balance between the reduction in our emissions and the amount of carbon that the trees are taking up instead. So in that way, not quite getting to zero, but introducing what we would call negative emissions. So when people talk about planting trees to mitigate climate change, it's essential that it happens alongside drastically reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, because we simply cannot take up enough carbon through planting trees. And it's more that we're talking about it as something to help us get to a point where we're not having a net positive contribution of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, but it definitely can't solve the whole problem. And I think planting trees gets attention because it's a way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but it's also got a lot of the other benefits that we've spoken about.
Right.
And so it's something positive that we can do that in 30 years' time, we can feel confident that we would be living in a country that has got more woodland, and hopefully it's done in a way that the natural wildlife that we have here, and also the people living here, it's done in a way that actually enhances people's well-being, provides opportunities for people to spend time there, but it's also good for biodiversity. And I think most of the other ways that we can think of artificially removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere don't really have those benefits. So I think that's kind of why it's seen as probably the number one option for doing that.
I think there's also something about getting people to physically do something too that's really calming and assuring, that someone, great, I'm going to go out and actually do this, and like I'm having an impact that's like associated with it as well. So
yeah, because you feel like you're actually making a positive contribution, because most of the things that we do, we are contributing to the emission of greenhouse gases. It's very difficult to live your life in a way that doesn't. And so whilst we can do everything that we can to try and minimise our carbon footprints, ultimately there's not much we can do to claw those emissions back once they've gone into the atmosphere. So I think, yeah, you're exactly right. There's a sense that by planting a tree, you're doing something practical, which is good. It's good anyway, getting people outside into these environments where they can do that. But I think feeling like you've made a contribution to something that's going to be there for years, decades to come, hopefully. And I think as well that people, if we want to be planting lots of trees, particularly in cities, involving the local communities is a great way to do it, because then they really have a sense of ownership over their new woodland, and it's something that they will want to look after.
Thanks a lot for coming, Kat. It was great to have you on the show today.
Thanks very much for inviting me.
yeah, thanks so much.
Stay tuned for upcoming episodes and visit our website, theclimatepress.com.
This podcast is available on Anchor, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Breaker, Overcast, SoundCloud, Pocket Casts and Radio Public. Thank you to all the artists who contributed music to this episode. For more information, please see the website.
See you soon! And remember, make love, not CO2.